Greetings, revolutionaries.
Hi there. Welcome to week 2 of Marx, and we're going to talk about capital and accumulation. I just realised there was one typo in the slides that I didn't even correct from
Well,
last year. Oh well,
we'll just have to deal with that. See if you can spot the typo.
I think it's quite easy.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Let's get started. So, quick recap from last week in terms of, so we're going to talk largely about theories of labour this week and about the creation of surplus value. John, you haven't added your things
I
here,
haven't
but
added my thing.
that's fine.
Yeah.
But so basically, to go back briefly to last week's reading, which was, as you recall, about theories of value, and you cannot talk about labour without also talking about value. Both labour and value are intimately connected up because value, if you think back to last week, is made up through, I can't read my own writing, through trapped labour power, which is congealed in a commodity. So labour power is congealed in a commodity, and labour power is that which creates value. And we'll go through the reasons of why it does that. So first of all, we're going to talk about the distinctions between capital and money. And money as money is something different from money as capital. Capital is money that circulates, as Marx writes. It is money that you launch into circulation. It is money that is used in a certain way. So money as money and money as capital, the difference is that money as capital is that which circulates. So the first distinction between money and money as capital is nothing more than a difference in their form of circulation. And Marx gives us two formulas initially in Capital. So the first one is this transformation of commodity into money and back into commodity with a random comma there, which is this formulation CMC, so commodity, money, commodity. And this is the formula that applies if you're wanting to buy a commodity. So in order to buy a commodity, money, you invest money into this commodity and you get a commodity back. And so money is withdrawn from this process of the market sphere because you end up with getting another commodity. And so this kind of circulation of money ends there. It ends with the commodity. It ends with the use value of the commodity. So you go and buy jeans and the sort of circulation of money ends with the pair of jeans that you buy. The example that Marx gives is I think wine and corn, and so if I want to buy wine, or if I have say commodity, if I have wine to begin with and I want to exchange it for corn, this passes through the money form, but I end up with having corn rather than wine because I want to have corn and not wine. So the process of exchange ends there. The other formula that Marx gives us is money, commodity, money, and that is the money as capital formula that he gives us. The result in which the whole process vanishes is the exchange of money for money. So in that kind of formulation, you're interested only in making more money, and you cut out the commodity there really because you're not interested in commodity as use value. You're only interested in exchange value. So you're only interested in accumulating money. But here, so you cut out the commodity because you're not interested in it. You're not interested in its use value. So what Marx does in Capital Volume 1 is that he presupposes what he calls the law of equivalence, and I'll get back to that in a minute. I'll just read this quotation first. This reflux of money to its starting point does not depend on the commodities being sold for more than was paid for it. That only has a bearing on the amount of money which flows back. The phenomenon of reflux itself takes place as soon as the purchased commodity is resold, i.e. as soon as the cycle MCM has been completed. We have, therefore, a palpable difference between the circulation of money as capital and its circulation as mere money. So basically what Marx presupposes in Capital, Volume 1, is what he calls this law of equivalence, which means that you pay exactly what the value of a commodity is. He is, as such, assuming, like the political economists that he answers to and that he's in fact criticizing, that the market works according to the law of equivalence. When I buy a commodity, he's saying, according to this law of equivalence, I'm paying exactly what it is worth. So it's not that the seller sells me his commodity at a higher price than it is worth. I'm paying exactly its equivalent value. And this is an idealized way of market relations that Marx is assuming. And he's doing that, interestingly, because he wants to show that capitalism is diseased in its very form, even if you assumed this law of equivalence, which is not obviously how the market actually works. It's an idealized form of market relations, which is based on this kind of equivalence between commodities, which is not how it works. But as I said, Marx is doing that in order to dismantle the whole capitalist culture, which he is at pains to demonstrate throughout Capital bears its own downfall written within itself, even if it operated according to the law of equivalence, which it doesn't, because the way that capitalism operates is all about the exploitation of labour power, which is what we'll get to in a minute. So to go back to that formula MCM, as you can see here, it's changed slightly to MCM delta, because the simple circulation of commodities, I'm reading out this citation, selling in order to buy, is a means to a final goal which lies outside circulation, namely the appropriation of use values, the satisfaction of needs. So that would be the other formula, CMC. You're selling a commodity in order to buy another commodity to satisfy your needs. As against this, the circulation of money as capital is an end in itself, for the valorization of value takes place only within this constantly renewed movement. The movement of capital is therefore limitless. Okay, so MCM delta. So the point of this formulation, that MCM that Marx gave us initially, is actually pointless, because there's no point if not more money comes out of the process than you had before. On page 251, this is where Marx talks about this this process. So to exchange £100 for cotton and then to exchange the same cotton again for £100 is merely a roundabout way of exchanging money for money, the same for the same, and appears to be an operation as purposeless as it is absurd, because you don't go out there, you know, in order to make the same £100 back that you've just tried to push on to someone else. So the idea is that you don't want to end up with the same £100 that you began with, but you'd like to have £110, coming out of this exchange. So the original amount in this MCM delta, you have the original amount advanced plus an increment, and that increment is what Marx calls surplus value. Actually, I've gone a wee bit fast here already. Let's go back to this slide. So this commodity, money, commodity, as we said earlier, is interested only in the exchange value. He's talking about the satisfaction of needs. Here, though, the last MCM delta, it is the exchange value that is an end in itself. And this exchange value occurs only if you constantly throw money into the circulation process. And this movement, as Marx says, is limitless. Capital, if you recall, is value which is in constant motion. And Marx also has this example of a hoarder, or what he calls a miser, hoarding his money And that is not capital. It is just money, because you're saving that kind of money as treasure from circulation. So you're hoarding treasure, but you're not investing it, which means that that kind of money that you're hoarding isn't capital, because you're not throwing it back into circulation. The whole point is that capital is constantly moving. And if you listen to David Harvey's amazing lectures, you can't say that capital is a thing, because precisely capital exists only in this ceaseless motion, which is why we get to this slide from the Terminator, because the movement of limitless capital, this is what it leads to. It leads to scorched earth. In Grundrisse, Marx writes that capital cannot abide a limit. It never conceives of anything that stops it, or must, or can stop it. This is where all the sort of vampirist rhetoric comes from, because the accumulation of absolute wealth also means, on the other hand, total exsanguination, total exploitation of labor. And when you think about the crises of capitalism, we've put this short 11-minute animation up on Mole, which goes through the crisis of capitalism. Again, this is David Harvey's work, and if you listen to it, he's arguing that capitalism never solves its crises, but always just shoves them off elsewhere into a different geographical area. And all capital wants to do is expand. It constantly wants to grow. It wants to grow towards absolute wealth, and at any cost, at the cost of the depletion of labor eventually, and also the depletion of the planet. In a way, you could say that capital is cancer. Okay, so Marx is wondering, where does surplus value, e.g. profit, come from? And part of the reading for this week is that he takes you through a history of conditions to think about where it might come from. And Marx says that surplus is something that can't exist outside of circulation if the law of equivalence is preserved. Recall that he is presuming an idealized way of market relations where I don't pay more for the commodity, the pair of jeans, than it is worth. Right, that is the sort of idealized presupposition. So surplus money can come from pricing the commodity at a higher value than it actually should be. So that means it can't exist outside of circulation, and it can't exist inside of circulation either, because circulation redistributes, but it's not something that can create value. It only moves money about, but it's not something that generates any more value than it had to begin with. So value, the surplus value, can be created in the marketplace because it presumes that commodities are traded at their value, and it can't exist inside of circulation either, because the market exchange might redistribute value, but it can't, as Marx thinks or writes, create value. As long as this equivalent, this law of equivalent exists, surplus value can't come from the selling of commodities. So where does it come from? Well, Marx says there's only one way that you can create surplus value, and that is through labor. In order for value to be created, something, he says, must take place in the background, which is not visible in the circulation process, and that is the only place where value is created. The only place where value is created is in a process of production, e.g. through the labour process. The labour process is that which creates value. The change in value, e.g. surplus value, can therefore originate only in the actual use value of the commodity, i.e. in its consumption. In order to extract value of the consumption of a commodity, our friend, the money owner, must be lucky enough to find within the sphere of circulation on the market a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being the source of value, whose actual consumption is therefore itself an objectification of labour, hence a creation of value. The possessor of money does find such a special commodity on the market, the capacity for labour. In other words, labour power. So the capitalist must find a commodity that is able to generate more value than it itself consumes. Basically, what is in the background here is bodies that are plundered. And the way that you extract value from this commodity that is labor power is all about sustenance, right? So labor power is a power that you offer. If you think back to last week's reading, you offered as labor power, and this offer of labor power, of your own labor power, makes you into a commodity. And in order to function, you must eat, you must have shelter, and you must have clothing. And these are the means of sustenance that labor power needs in order to realize itself. But, right, so the labor power is a commodity, and the value of labor power is determined by the value of labor power necessary for production, right? You think back of last week's reading as well. It's about socially necessary labor time, and in order for labor time to create something, you must have subsistence, food, clothing, shelter, and this labor power exists only as a capacity of the living individual, and this living individual obviously must eat, and it must feel relatively sheltered and must have clothes on her back. So the capitalist pays you for the labor power that you sell. However, there's a difference between the labor power that he pays you for and the labor power that you actually provide. So if I want to sell my labor to the capitalist, and I must sell my labor to the capitalist because none of us have a trust fund, because I also need to eat, and I must eat because otherwise my labor power is very quickly depleted, right? So, and the capitalist must therefore pay me in order that I can work. But the capitalist only pays me a minimum. He pays me the minimum that I must have in order to barely survive. The means that I have is a minimum amount that I can work for the capitalist. So the ultimate or minimum limit of the value of labor power is formed by the value of the commodities which have to be supplied every day to the bearer of labor power, the man, so that he can renew his life processes. So the capitalist pays me the absolute minimum that I need in order to eat, in order to live sheltered, and in order to have a coat made of linen or wool. So I need a certain amount of commodities in order to live, in order to produce commodities for the man, e.g. the capitalist. So wherever I might work, Marx is saying, I only get the minimum that I need in order to live, but wherever I might work, that's also where surplus value happens. So it happens inside a production, inside the factory, inside the university. So my working day, for example, ostensibly consists of 8 hours a day, but the capitalist pays only for, let's say, 3. In the remaining 5 hours, which I don't get paid for, I produce surplus value for the capitalist. But even though I've given a really simple example here of where the time that the capitalist pays me for ends and where surplus time and the production of surplus value begins, it's actually very difficult to see where surplus value begins, e.g. whereas I stop working for the capitalist and when I start working for free, as it were, for the capitalist. So it's very difficult to see where that kind of ends. And Marx talks about that more in detail in the struggle for the working day, if you're interested in looking that up. So in that passage, he's talking about like the difficulty to see where surplus labor, begins. And he's talking, for example, the example that he gives, he takes a minute of the day, and he's saying that you might work 30 seconds of a minute where you work off the means of sustenance, and another 30 seconds where you work for free to produce surplus value for the capitalist. But you can't say for sure where the one thing ends and the other begins. So I'm just going to wrap up a little bit of what we've said here, and then John does his bit. So basically what Marx is arguing in these kind of sections from Capital is that labour power depletes itself eventually for the capitalist. And when Marx is talking about the working day, he is talking about the degree of exploitation because of the bloodthirst for surplus value. And so this kind of working day and the degree of exploitation, it is about, as I said earlier, bodies being plundered. And there are also bodies that lend themselves to more plunder than others. And you might think, for example, of women, the gender pay gap. Generally, women still get paid less than men for the same amount, for the same values, for the same labour that they do. So the bodies of women generally are plundered more. And you might also think about cheap immigrant labour, people working on fruit farms, for example, picking fruit, whose labour is constantly undercut, and they're getting paid, I'm not sure, £3 a day. So you might also want to think that there's a gender and race issue in terms of this exploitation of labour power. And with that, I'm going to hand over to John.
One of the things that interests me most in this course and in other courses as well is the relationship between ideology and materiality. So we think of these two terms as being something like opposites. So ideology in a Marxist sense refers to false consciousness. So that means a way in which we are encouraged to adopt a particular kind of worldview that in Marxist analysis is separate from the real grounds of our existence. So I'm going to look at 4 materialities and how they are constituted ideologically, but how they might also constitute limit points of ideology. So there are points at which capitalism, despite its limitless trajectory, must recognise finally points at which it reaches obstacles perhaps that it might stop. So I quoted in the last vodcast the quotation from Frederick Jameson about it being easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, and that is a quotation that refers specifically to limits. So Fabian mentioned how capitalism shoves off its crises to somewhere else, it outsources its crises, but we might think about where is that somewhere else. Think, for example, about waste. When you throw away a bit of plastic packaging, where is this away of which we speak? It's not some magical other metaphysical place into which it's disappeared, but it's actual fact a material location. So there's all kinds of like literary and filmic imaginings of the end of the world in relation to litter. So Philip K. Dick's great novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep imagines the end of the world in kipple, which is kind of litter, just general bits of kind of detritus that surround us. So that's an example of the return of the limits. We might think of that in a Freudian sense as a kind of return of the repressed. If capitalism represses the idea of its own limits, though that fiction of unlimitedness ultimately returns. So nuclear waste is another great example of something that's repressed but which might explode back into consciousness. So 4 materialities. The first of these is nature. So this slide gives you a quotation from something that's not from this week's reading, that's moving into chapter 7. We've touched on nature in various quite a lot throughout this module so far in relation to Darwin, and also a little bit last week in relation to Kropotkin and Galton as well. So nature is, of course, the ultimate grounds of our material existence on the planet, the soil in which virgin state the soil in the virgin state in which it supplies man with necessaries or the means of subsistence ready to hand exists independently of him and is the universal subject of human labour. So the idea of independence is really important here. This is how the structural opposition between nature and culture works. Nature is that which is independent of the human. Culture is that which is made by the human. But obviously ideas of nature are cultural, and we might argue that forms of culture might in some senses be thought of as natural, but that's always a problematic move to make. So thinking back to Fabienne's point about the scorched earth of capitalism, how does capitalism utilise, how is it made possible, and how is it limited by the material grounds of our existence? So science fiction, I've already touched on Philip K. Dick, is a really useful example of this, how space, extraterrestrial civilizations function as the necessary endpoint or trajectory of capitalism. Once this nature is exhausted, once it's been used up, once the terrestrial limits of capitalism has been reached, it must expand off the planet. So this is why environmentalism and Marxism are very closely related, because they're both forms of critique of capitalism. So nature is one way in which we must think about the limits of capitalism. Another is time. So capitalism, in a sense, invents time in the 19th century. So we've got here on the screen a 19th century train timetable, Edinburgh and suburban services including Core, Stoffine and Musselburgh branches. So this might seem like banal and spurious, but train timetables in the 19th century are the point at which, or the means by which, time becomes standardised. So in the late 18th century, it would be a different time in Doncaster than it is in Sheffield. It's only the existence of a national network of railways in Britain that means it needs to be the same time in Doncaster is in Sheffield. And this is in relation to the movement of commodities, the movement of raw materials throughout the country, as well as the movement of people to work and on leisure excursions as well. So time is produced by the development of a particular kind of consumer industrial capitalism in the 19th century, which is why in Joseph Conrad's novel The Secret Agent, the anarchists who want to destroy capitalism want to blow up Greenwich Mean Time. If you destroy time, you can destroy capitalism. A slightly mad way that these anarchists have of going about it. We might also say that one of the most fundamental mechanisms by which capitalism manages its subject is through the organisation of time. So the previous slide I showed the clocking in box, or the clocking in card. So the ways in which there are technologies of time management. And this is all to do with the management of labour, of course. We started with the proposition that labour is bought and sold at its value. Its value is determined by the working time necessary to its production. So time, on one level, represents quite loosely the movement of the cosmic bodies in relation to one another, the circling of the Earth in relation to the Sun. In a more specific experiential way, it's clock time, which is how capitalism is experienced, how it is organised, how it is able to function.
I'm just going to interject something, because I read recently Jonathan Creary's book on sleep 24/7, which is really interesting if you think about time and capitalism and the way that capitalism thinks about sleep. And apparently it reorganized the way that we sleep. So in pre-capitalist times, people would go to bed at around 7 p.m. and sleep till midnight, and then get up and go to their friend's house till 3 or 4, and then go back to bed till about 10 in the morning. And obviously that kind of rhythm of sleep is no longer feasible according to capitalist time.
Related to that, and related to the next slide, we may also think about dreaming, something we'll discuss a lot more in relation to Freud in a couple of weeks' time. But capitalism also structures the way that we dream. And it structures, I think, the way that we dream in relation to muscle memory. So if any of you have ever had, I'm sure you must have had really repetitive jobs. So if you go to sleep, it's like your body can't forget that, and it re-emerges in dreaming. So I remember when I had a job like washing dishes in a Mexican restaurant years ago. I'd finish work late, I'd go straight to bed, but it was still there in my body and my mind. So capitalism also reorganises the materiality of the body. The second essential condition, Marx writes, which allows the owner of money to find labour power in the market as a commodity is this: the possessor of labour power, instead of being able to sell commodities in which his labour has been objectified, must rather be compelled to offer for sale as a commodity that very labour power that exists only in his living body. So the living body, the organic grounds of human being, is obviously what underpins labour. You can't labour without a body, even if you are brain workers such as we, that is still an embodied experience. There's another quotation from later in the section from Capital we're reading this week that refers to capitalism as a form of body modification in order to modify the general nature of the human organism in such a way that it acquires skill and dexterity in a given branch of industry and becomes labour power of a developed and specific kind. A special education or training is needed. So capitalism acts through your bodily existence. But the body, of course, is a point at which capitalism must recognise certain limits. Workers die, a great inconvenience to 19th century industrialists in particular, before the trade union movement had secured certain health and safety responsibilities for employers. There's only so much work you can do a day. If you're worn out, you're going to work less efficiently. So this is obviously a limit point of capitalism. How much can it squeeze out of the body before the body ceases to function? How can it organise bodies into these great hives of activities in order to keep them alive sufficiently in order to be able to service the machine? Very famous Marxist quotation, a slogan even: all that is solid melts into air. So if capitalism is trying to secure its own limitlessness, it's trying to erase those three limits: the limits of nature or the environment, the limits of time, and the limits of the worker's body. But of course, these solidities must be acknowledged. As much as capitalism might want them to melt into the air, we as critics, we as workers recognise and experience all of these materialities, which are grounds in which capitalism operates. There's a fourth materiality that I'll gesture briefly towards, as something that's not so explicitly in the reading we're looking at this week, but which haunts Marx. So Marx writes a lot about mechanisation as a form of so the human becomes like an appendage to the machine. So the image here is of Stellark, an Australian installation artist who's always building these like third arms and stuff like that. So he's interested in biotechnology, about extending the limits of the human body through the use of machines to accomplish additional tasks. So he's writing evolution with his prosthetic third arm on the wall here. So the point is that the machine is the next stage in human evolution. Which leads me to one of my favourite 19th century thinkers. So have I mentioned Samuel Butler before? I'm always mentioning Samuel Butler. A gay shepherd, an atheist, a radical interpreter of Darwin, a real kind of oddball, curmudgeonly figure, very interesting guy, who in this essay, Darwin Among the Machines, anticipates perhaps our current world, in which the machines are gaining ground upon us. Day by day, we're becoming more subservient to them. More men are daily bound down as slaves to tend them. More men are daily devoting the energies of their whole lives to the development of mechanical life. So a slide here that I suppose takes us a little bit back towards Darwinism, but it also invites us to think about how the machine as the mechanism by which capitalism operates is something that radically alters human ontologies. It changes human labour, changes how we relate to one another, how we experience ourselves as well.
And this links back to Philip K. Dick, to
Yeah.
Andrew's Dream of Electric Sheep as well, where it's all about the value of what mechanical life might have.
Do machines have consciousness? Because that's the test, isn't it? I forget what you call the
The
test.
Vodcast test.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's about empathy, whether you have empathy.
And this is also to do with ideas of the real as well. And so all of them, we're talking about ideology and materiality. I mean, ultimately invites us to think about a favourite question of mine: is capitalism real? How do we begin to think about that question? How do we know that we're real? What do we really mean by real anyway, and why does it matter to ask? But that is a question for another time. Workshop task. Ponder nature, time, and the body. So dig into the reading, chapters 4, 5 and 6 of Capital, and connect this to the text as well. I'm very keen that we anchor our conversations in the text and don't wander off too much. Though we're always wandering. It's fine to wander off a bit, but come back. So that's the task for next week. Nature, time, the body. Quotations from this week's reading from Marx. You might want to look at last week's reading from Marx as well. There might be some counterpoints there. That's it.
Yep. Thanks very much.
Yep.
See
you later.
Bye.